So we are now in the manager lounge at Hotel Tia with the photographer who's taken some iconic photos of the music scene and Liverpool. And we are lucky to be having them up on the wall here in the manager lounge. Francesco, tell me a little bit about you and why on earth did an Italian from the south of Italy end up in Liverpool?
Well, I ended up here simply because of my love of the Beatles, and that was the first thing. And then secondary was I found out about Liverpool Football Club, and I came to find out about Liverpool when they played the now infamous game against Inter Milan. I think it was 67, 68, and I just couldn't believe when the scenes, were from Anfield. I thought that was incredible, the crowd and the singing, but it was the first thing that my love of the Beatles was why I came here.
I've heard rumors you learned English from listening to the Beatles.
And the Rolling Stones, yes. Yeah, so I kind of self-taught back home from the age of about 10. I tried to learn. I mean, don't ask me how I was trying to learn English, but so I had dictionaries. I had so all sorts of mad things. That anything that I could pick on to kind of learn something. And then I was lucky because for sheer coincidence, a young boy who had relatives back in my hometown. For some reason, he ended up from New York in my hometown, but he was bilingual, so he could speak both Italian and English. But he was born in New York. But anyway, he ended up in my hometown, and through him, then I could learn properly. So that's how I picked up some of my English to begin with. And then by 16 years of age, I left and just traveled around Europe, and fully aware that I would end up here. I wanted to be here, and that's why I'm here.
So music, football and Liverpool was early your passion, but what about photographing?
Well, photography more or less was, it was something that I always loved, not as photographer, but as in the shapes of films. So, as a young boy, I've told innumerable times, if my mother wanted to find me or looking for me, she knew exactly where I was. I would be in the cinema, in the local cinema, watching that film probably 5 times over. I was fascinated by the imagery, by the sounds, by just the glamour of it. And so, yeah, and then I was about 17 years old and ended up in Turin for about a year, 9 months maybe, whatever it was. And I met this guy called Stefano Valle, young. He was slightly older than me, but he was doing photography and he was a photographer. And then he introduced me to that. And then I became aware of, the person that kind of, his influence me. His name is Don McCullin, famous war photographer. So I've always admired his work. And then when I arrived in Liverpool, I decided that would be, after doing all the jobs, I decided that, I should go do a course and try and, learn how to be a photographer.
And you being a photographer brought you so close to your other passion, music, the music scene in Liverpool. Tell me what you got access to and a couple of the many experiences you had in your heydays through the punk time and...
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, photography was for me my way into the music industry. I wanted to be part of it. I knew that I had to be part of it somehow because I love music so much. You can't sing, I can't play, so photography, it wasn't that calculated, but it eventually, that's how it turned out. And through photography, I started, somebody told me about Eric's, this club, which is now legendary, and everybody in those days played through there, so lots of people became famous through it, and all people that were already established played through there. So you can mention almost every major punk band and new wave band played down there. So it was a perfect place for me, and I recall going there the first time, and I just couldn't believe, So, and I think my first photographs were photographs of the Ramones. I think that was probably one of my first photos. It was either that or the Human League, I think. It was one of the two, but I definitely remember they probably been the Ramones. But you know, immediately you knew that something was happening down there, and you know, and there was all the people that are now become stars. So you know, the first time there, I remember seeing Pete Wily, Ian McCulloch at the bar, and then just around the corner was Pete Burns and some of the other people. So you know, it was like, wow, this is fantastic, you know. And one of the things that I remember about Eric's particularly is, you know, the gigs were so hot. I mean, you know, because there was always overcrowded. There was never really, you know, the proper number of people. So if it was licensed for 300, I guarantee you, there's certain gigs there must have been at least 500. I mean, sweat was pouring off the ceiling, you know, people pushing, but I mean, it was just a remarkable thing. So these are the kind of experience that I remember. You know, the Ramones was really hard, the Stranglers was incredibly hard, Susie and the Banshees was unbelievable. Eh?
The access you had there.
Oh, there's, yeah. So, thanks for reminding me. Yeah, and also one of the things Luna just reminded was the fact that in those days you had access. You know, I mean, I was literally on the stage with them, and you know, you could just arrive and talk to them, and they were, you know, the mentality of the bands were completely different. They were much more friendly, and they would allow you to do things. You didn't have to go through like a PR or a manager. You know, they just allow you to do what. They knew that you were part of what, you know, of that scene, and they accepted you. You know, they didn't ask questions. They say, okay, well, you're a photographer, take the photograph. You know, you had very easy access. So I was really lucky in that respect, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to take the kind of photographs that I took.
Can you say something about the importance of Liverpool as a music hub in your heydays, taking all those photos?
I think, you know, I mean, you know, well, what can you say? Liverpool is known as the capital of music, and for me personally, there's no question about it. It is. I mean, simply because, you know, if nothing else, because of the Beatles. So, you know, they guarantee that status, because there's nothing other than the Beatles there, you know, nothing bigger than that. And in my view, they won't be ever, not in as far as the group is concerned. So, you know, it's hugely important, you know, because it's made Liverpool known globally. But you know, but the unfortunate thing is that a lot of people that are born in this city, they somehow don't realize that, and sometimes they get annoyed because, you know, people don't get it, and they say that, you know, it's like some people criticize the Beatles, and I say no, you know, there's just whatever you think, you may criticize the individuals, but the point is their influence, you know, is huge. You know, basically, it's a global influence. They've influenced fashion, they've influenced music, they've influenced design, photography, everything. And so, it isn't just music with the Beatles; it's everything that they created. You know, and so yeah, it's hugely influential. And I think also the Eric's club scene, it was not as big in terms, because there was never really a group that was as big as the Beatles, but you know, there were probably 10, probably more bands that came out of Eric's. They were very, very successful. You know, the Bunnymen, Dead or Alive, Orchestral Maneuvers, that, you know, Why Heat. So there's quite a huge influence, and so therefore, you know, to have that, because relatively speaking, Liverpool is a small city. You know, so when you think how small the city is, to have such a level of creativity, it's fantastic.
And where did your photos end up?
Well, I was, you know, I started out and I was doing everything on my own, and I would go to London every fortnight, knocking on you know, on all the magazines doors, and again, in those days that was accepted. You know, you could just turn up and they just accepted you. So I would go there every fortnight, and I would make a nuisance of myself. But don't forget, I was a young man, so I didn't really care what they thought of me. You know, I just didn't care. And I think because I was so determined that eventually, you know, they start to lower their guard, and I think deep down, some of them start to admire my tenacity. And eventually, I was lucky. You know, I was lucky because one of my photographs I used to leave the prints there, you know, with the editors. And then, you know, the Liverpool bands broke through and they had my photographs there too, and they started using them. And then once one magazine used me, then everybody wanted to use me. And that's how I ended up working for The Face and New Musical Express, Melody Maker, Sounds, you know, Smash Hits, all the magazines and newspapers, you know. So it was just being there and being tenacious, really. So, which is what you need.
So what do you think of the fact that a little boutique Liverpool Football Club hotel up in Anfield Road is now dedicating the manager lounge to your work?
I'm absolutely thrilled, simply because, you know, this is something that has been close to my heart. I mean, I could go on forever about this, but the point is that even though that era has been musically, you know, only second to the Cavern and the Beatles and the so-called Mersey sound, you know, nobody locally has paid that much attention to that era. So I'm delighted that T Hotel is willing to do this, you know, because, and I'm really genuinely happy about it, because it's something that, apart from my personal gain, it's also the fact that that scene should be honored. You know, people should know about, you know, this other incredibly influential musical scene. You know, the Bunnymen are still talked about it today. You know, their first 3 albums are revered by, you know, bands like U2 and Coldplay. You know, they've influenced a lot of people. But again, you know, for that scene not to be, you know, showcased, to me, it's just sacrilege, really. So the fact that T Hotel is doing this, I'm delighted.
So Francesco, what have we got here?
Well, here we have 6 wonderful prints, which I have just delivered about 10 minutes ago. And this one that we have here is one of our local heroes, and that's Ian McCulloch from the band called Egg on the Bunnymen. Now, as you can see, he's very young here, and I think he was probably 20, 21 years old. And I took this photograph and in the offices of the then label called Zoo Records, which was situated in a place called Chicago Buildings, just close to Matthew Street. And Ian was always a little bit reluctant to let me photograph him. Don't know why, but anyway, I was doing this photo shoot for a magazine called Melody Maker, and I said, well, look, Ian, you know, I'm gonna have to photograph you because, you know, it's better for you because you're gonna feature in the Melody Maker. So he agreed to, you know, for me to photograph him. So, and I really like that photo. You know, it's a nice, it's kind of relaxed, and he looks good.
And what else have you brought with you?
There we are. And then we have here another one. Let me see what this is. Okay, so here we have the very fabulous, very wonderful Pete Burns of Dead or Alive. Pete and I became very good friends, and eventually I became his manager. And in fact, it was probably about 6 months after I took this photo that he asked me to manage him. And we were walking down Ball Street one day because he was working in Prob Records, and I saw this poster there which was advertising Kestrel beer, and I like the idea. The slogan there says it bites. So I said, Peter, stand in front of it, because most people thought that, you know, Pete was the kind of person that would bite. So I thought that you know, the juxtaposition of the way that he looked and you know, it bites. I thought that would make a really good photograph. And then we have here a very unusual photo. It's very unusual, and probably you can see why it's unusual. Can you see why it's unusual? what's the car?
Royce.
Right, exactly. Now that's 1981 in Liverpool in Matthew Street, and that's a Rolls Royce. And some people think that that was actually staged, and in fact it wasn't. I was actually photographing in that street that day for one of my friends who was an architect, and I was doing basically some photographs for him. And I thought, well, I'll take photographs of that building, you know, the Liverpool School of Language and Fun, whatever it's called, which is now called Flanagan's, I think. And just as I was taking the photograph, that Rolls Royce was driving past, and I thought, wow, that's an amazing thing. I better take some photos, and I did. I'm glad I did. So that's the backstory to that. And then we have some more here. Let's see what we got here. Wonderful. And then here, okay, here we have a crowd shot, and this is one of my best-selling photographs, by the way, and for obvious reasons, because there's lots of people in there, in the crowd, and of course, if you're in that crowd, you want a print of it, and quite a few people in that crowd have bought prints. This was taken at the Pier Head, and in the 80s there was, it became sort of fashionable to have gigs on the boat called the Royal Iris, and on this particular occasion the gig was the band they were playing that night were Magazine, a band called Magazine from Manchester, and the support band was Pete Wily, you know, Heart as Big as Liverpool, and he was the support act, and I kind of instinctively knew that this would be a good shot, so I positioned myself somewhere high up so that I could cover as much of the crowd as I possibly could, you know, without losing, you know, the definition on the faces. And so that's basically is one of my best-selling photographs. And then here we have another one, and this is the very scouse, the very Mr. Liverpool, Pete Wily, well known for his you know, Heart as Big as Liverpool song, which is, I believe, played at every Liverpool home game. And the other guys on the right hand side there is Rob Jones, who was the drummer, and Washington, who was the bass player. And if you look closely, this photo, they were outside the Catholic Cathedral, but if you look in the glass there, you see the Anglicans reflected in it. And I thought, I didn't see that at the time, I'll be honest, but it's only when I printed and I thought, wow, you know, I got both cathedrals in one shot. You know, so, and this photograph appeared in several magazines, you know, at the time, Smash Hits, Record Mirror, and a few others. And then we have this, which is the very, very famous, legendary Prob Records. And there are so many stories about this record shop. I mean, literally thousands of people used to sit on those steps, and everyone will have a story to tell. And the majority of the story center around the fact that Pete Burns used to work in there. And he was acerbic, to say the least, to most people. If you went in there and you were asking for a record that he thought wasn't good, he would just tell you to do one. You probably know. Exactly. And this is no word of a lie. I mean, one day he actually somebody asked for a record and he just threw it on the street. So whatever, right. So anyway, but the perverse thing is that everybody loved to be mistreated by him, because if he approved as some, you know, for something that you went to buy, and he gave his seal of approval, you walked out, you know, as most young people tell me, they used to walk out of there, you know, walking on air because he had approved. So that's, but there, I mean, it's a legendary place, really. I mean, Pete Wily worked in there, several other people, all well known, you know, and this is part of, you know, Proper Records is part of that triumvirate or trio of places which were in Matthew Street. So it was Eric's, the Armadillo Tea Rooms, and Proper Records. This was like the Holy Trinity, you know. If you were a young man, woman in those days, that's where you would go. And so that's, and I really like that picture, you know, and it's the fact that there is that guy walking out, it gives that element of, you know, of humanity, so to speak. So it's, and again, this is one of my good selling photographs as well. And I think that's it, isn't it? Yeah.